في كلمة more وبتختاروا اللغة اللي عايزين تسمعوا بيها المحاضرة. Okay. So let's welcome everyone and just say that we're happy that we meet you all again in this fourth and last lecture in this series of 4 lectures. Hopefully it's not the last one with Dr. Brenner. This series of lectures is titled the Autism in Psychoanalysis. And our valued guest, Dr. Leon Brenner, was generous to give us this series of 4 lectures so far. And this is the 4th one, which will be titled Constructing an Affective and Intersubjective Vocabulary. So, short introduction for Dr. Leon, as mostly we all know him by now, but he's a psychoanalyst and psychoanalytic theorist from Berlin, and he's graciously accepted that he joins us for this series of lectures. If you have your mics open, please just make sure that you switch them off during the lecture, not to have any interruptions with the translation and the sounds. So I will leave the stage now for Dr. Brenner, and here you go.
Thank you, Phoebe. I'm really glad to be here again. Sadly, our last session, but as you said, there might be surprises. I have a technical question before I begin. It's technical, so I'll not be as slow as I will be very soon. I want to share a few images today, so I wonder, oh, I am the co-host. Great. Okay, so I can do it. Good. So as I secretly told some of you before we began, I forgot that today we're going to have a shorter talk and then a longer section for questions. So I prepared something a bit longer. So we will reframe it. And the idea was to speak about these creations, the synthesis that autistic subjects create within language. And the idea was to speak about the drive. So to speak about these effects that we strictly call psychoanalytic. That is in relation, in comparison to, for instance, effects of the intellect, like understanding, like insight, which are not strictly psychoanalytic. They happen in analysis, but they're not only of analysis. The effects on the level of the drive are strictly psychoanalytic. Now, the drive is a very important psychoanalytic concept. And it is explained, it is best explained through its distinction from the instinct. Now, those of you that read Freud in English might have noticed that there is a horrific translation error in the canonical translations by
سامعين لكن الصوت مش تمام يقطع.
I'm sorry, Dr. Brenner. It seems that we have a problem with the Arabic translation, so can just interrupt you for a moment.
Sure, no problem at all.
نسأل على القناة العربي whenever يعني
ممتاز.
whenever you're ready.
تمام دكتور.
Okay, so we're sorry about this interruption. We can go on now. So, thank you.
I know Mumtaz is excellent, so
perfect. Good Arabic, yes.
So I was saying that there is a terrible translation error by Strachey, who was the official translator of Freud, where Strachey translates 2 completely distinct words in German into the same word in English. These are the words Trieb and instinct. Now, you might have guessed that instinct translates to instinct. But Trieb is not instinct. It is drive. And Trieb and instinct have nothing in common. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the instinct. The instinct is a hardwired biological program that the organism is born with, which compels the organism to fight for its survival. So the instinct acts to fulfill what we as an organism have as instinctual needs by raising tension levels when the organism's needs arise and lowering them when these needs are satisfied. This is a dynamic equilibrium, and you can think about it like a sinus wave, like a sinus function. It is homeostatic. It is the organismic rhythm, something like this. Now, the drive, and this is something that Freud insists on, is imprinted on the psyche, not on the level of the instinct. But on the other hand, it is also not imprinted on the level of ideation, of tangible ideas. Freud says it is on the frontier between the somatic and the mental. And what it does is it actually marks a rupture in this instinctual organization of the human organism. It happens, this is if we follow Lacan, it happens when the infant takes on itself this way of language. We were speaking about this several times in the past. So already you might have some intuitions of what's to come. So the drive is the unique byproduct of this encounter between the organism and language. It embodies the mutual effect that they have on each other. So it has to do with the way the body enjoys and the way one suffers, and it shapes these tendencies from a very early age. This is what Freud called drive fixation. Now, I'll skip a little forward to Lacan, who drew a schema in order to exemplify the way the drive is commonly fixated. So I'll share this image now. Here it is. Everyone sees this? Some nodding faces.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, good, good. So this is a schema that develops what Freud initially gave us in terms of the 4 components of the drive. And if you look at it, you'll see that it illustrates the movement of the drive in the body. So basically, we see the thrust of the drive represented by an arrow that moves in a circular trajectory, originating from the rim of the erogenous orifice, be it oral, anal, scopic, invocatory, and then aims the trajectory around the object, finally returning to its source. And the source is represented in the schema by the goal. And what you see here is that the drive circuit is circular, and it never ends. It is what Freud calls a constant force. And this is why, for instance, when one is hungry, they might go and eat a sandwich to fulfill their instinctual needs. But it could also happen that once one is getting full, they will keep on eating a cake for dessert and maybe an ice cream as well, etc., etc. I'll try and I have another image I want to share with you that I drew that exemplifies this movement. Okay. So here you see that the drive moves downwards, meaning we get hungry, right? And then we eat food, enough to satisfy our instinctual need. But then we order another cake, and we have a milkshake, and we smoke a cigarette, and then we have a nice digestif, and we continue something on that line that has nothing to do with the instinct for survival. So you see here in this schema that I drew for you that the satisfaction of the drive is not related to the object of the instinctual need, but rather to the perpetuation of the drive's movement ad infinitum, forever. So you see in this schema, the drive branches from the instinctual rhythm that is represented by the sinus formula. So the drive is involved in the initiation and preservation of this relationship that I was speaking about between the body and language. And one of the major hypotheses that I develop in my work, and I think that you've seen that each lecture touched on a different aspect of my work on autism. And again, it is a presentation, it is rudimentary, and I'm inviting all of you to keep on studying and thinking about it, reading about it. So today we'll speak about another major hypothesis, that in autism, something in the inscription of the drive circuit is foreclosed, is deterred, brought to an alteration. Now, this change, this alteration, is not what we see in psychosis. So in psychosis, I'll just say this quickly, we speak about the foreclosure of the signifier of the name of the father, and that has some effects also on drive functioning. But what I speak about in terms of autism is a singular foreclosure, an autistic foreclosure that takes a particular element from the drive circuit as its object. This element is the rim, Bord in French, the rim, Grenze in German. We have some German speakers today, I think. I'm not sure how to say it in Arabic. But the border, a rim. Like the cup has a rim. Now, this I call the foreclosure of the rim of the drive. And I developed the notion of the rim in many works. It's a very interesting notion that we can find in Lacan and use in our understanding of autism. Now, when the rim is foreclosed, and I'll just quickly show you that schema again. So this is the rim, right? The rim of the drive, the rim of the erogenous zone. So when the rim is foreclosed, the drive short circuits. It aimlessly emerges from a rimless source, unable to circumvent the object and return to its goal, as you can see in this schema that I show you right now. And in this sense, it jeopardizes the preservation of a stable relationship between the body and language. Now, we see many autistic subjects having difficulties relating to their bodies and experiencing them as fragmented, unorganized, sometimes as this indiscernible mass of stimuli and sensation. This happens at an early age, but also we see autistic adults speaking about meltdowns. Now, what I argue is that the foreclosure of the rim interferes with the role that language plays in the organization of the body. And I argue that this might be the case, but that this type of privation can be supplemented through the construction of a secondary rim. And this is done by the autistic use of signs. You already know what signs are. So that gives me a great relief. We don't have to go through this today. Now, in my work so far, I've attempted to identify different modalities in the utilization of the sign in constructing supplementary rims to the drive. And these modalities are something of a functional heading that groups a variety of solutions that I've seen in the work with autistic subjects and in engaging with autistic adults, ways that they use to treat the alterations in the drive circuit. Now, they are divided into three versatile general types. The first I call protective rims. The second I call systemizing rims. And the third I call incorporating rims. Now, each of these is characteristic of a particular dynamism for the subject in its engagement with the body, with knowledge, and with the social bond. And in this sense, each of them dictates a different mode of operation for the subject and, accordingly, necessitates a distinct psychoanalytic position in the treatment and facilitation of autism, basically in the transference. Now, we'll try and talk about them today. Maybe we won't get to each and every one of them, but there are several papers where I really deeply delve into these distinctions. Last time, 3 weeks ago, we spoke about work with, let's say, more with autistic individuals that are more endowed within language. So let's start on the other side of the spectrum today. Let's start with protective rims. Now, protective rims come to treat the intolerable intrusions that autistic subjects feel in the body. They materialize in shielded interactions with objects that these children or adults contingently stumble upon in their environment. And through these consistent object interactions, autistic subjects are able to harness their dynamic quality to construct a protective rim that guards their body from the intrusion of stimuli. There's a very interesting object relation psychoanalyst called Franz Tuston from the UK. And she's noticed how autistic children attach hard objects to their bodies. And these objects are not used for their intended function, but they gain an idiosyncratic protective function. So, for example, a set of keys is essential for a child named Peter that Tuston speaks about, but he doesn't use these keys to open cupboards or doors. He doesn't play with them in a way that mimics the function of a key. They just protect him from the unbearable invasions of stimuli that enter his body, enabling him to survive a session. Now, these objects are called autistic objects, and they are sensation-dominated objects. This means that they don't take part in fantasy or play. We don't incorporate them in fantasy work or play work. They are felt as being an actual part of the child's body. Right? So they take part in intensively repetitive rituals. So this is what you will see, these rituals that, intense rituals that repeat themselves and occupy autistic subjects.
Je n'entends pas Iman, on l'entend absolument pas. Absolument pas.
Now, these rhythmic experiences, they isolate autistic
Can you
children.
just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
It seems like Iman is having a problem in the
Okay.
French channel.
Of course, yes.
On vous écoute, Madame Iman.
أنا سامعك. هي بس مدام قلت لك
احنا سامعين حضرتك.
ألو
Oui.
Gisèle,
Oui.
moi, je l'entends très bien. C'est quelque chose comme... On peut enregistrer. OK. OK. Au revoir.
Okay, so we can continue now.
Ready? Okay,
Sorry for the second interruption.
no
Thank you.
worries. Okay, so these interactions today have a common name in the autistic community. They're called autistic stimming. Right? You can open this on Google. You'll find that this is the term that autistic people use. Now, stimming is short for self-stimulatory behavior. And it's a term that some autistic individuals have adopted to describe these repetitive behaviors that give them a sense of control and help them cope with overwhelming external stimuli. It helps them calm down and even communicate their moods. And these behaviors include many things: hand flapping, spinning in circles, body rocking, manipulation of objects, vocalizations, such as grunting, muttering, many things. There are many different forms of stimming. So when we think about these stimming behaviors, these we think about it as particularly sensory based. And something that I might just quickly mention is that autistic children do not clearly differentiate between sensory modalities. So this means that they sometimes experience seeing and hearing as if they were being touched by an object. And an example, also I'll bring an example from Tustin's work with a child named David. And he comes to the conclusion that Tustin and Austin are the same because they feel the same when they touch his ears or eyes. That's, we call this today synesthesia in some dimensions. So we see that words can be autistic objects. And when these words take part in a repetitive stimulatory behavior, they can be described as stimming. Another example of a case of an autistic child named Juan. He goes on to touch different objects in the consulting room one by one. He doesn't play with them. He categorizes them. He calls them by their name. And the names of the objects are in isolation while handling the objects themselves. And by establishing an order in which the names of objects can be repeated, Juan creates a boundary, a rim that protects him in the counseling room, and he can be there without holding the psychoanalyst's hand, which was the solution prior. So what I'm trying to sort of demonstrate is that when we speak of autistic objects and their protective function, we don't have to speak of hard objects, actual objects, we might say, but of linguistic objects. And this, in order to understand this, we have to remember what a sign is, right? And we think of a sign as this type of an object. So I'll just quickly remind you that a sign is like a rigid linguistic object that has a direct and permanent relationship with a referent. So signs can be reliable placeholders for actual objects encountered in the world, right? Because they preserve this relationship. This relationship is not fluid. They preserve a relationship. So when a sign is matched with an autistic object, it can be independently used in stimming in the same way that an actual object is used to establish a protective rim for the body. So in other words, we were speaking about protective rims, right, through the mediation of autistic objects. But now we can speak of this transitive relationship, right, between bodily stimuli and the linguistic sign, right? And on the basis of this relationship, the dynamic function of an object can be captured in the construction of a protective rim that is, well, purely vocal. So think about it like this: a dynamic function associated with an object, with an autistic object, that is then associated with a sign. And these type of signs are used as protection. And when they provide the protection against the invasion of stimuli, the invasion of jouissance, at this point, they can also function as a gateway for further animation and incorporation in the social bond, right? So what I'm saying is that it seems that only after the child establishes a certain level of protection and predictability in their world that they are able to step out into the world. And this is why, for instance, we see examples where parents or therapists take away an autistic object that was used as a protective rim. And this is extremely tormenting and traumatic. We see a dramatic regression in the child's capacity to animate itself in the world. And this shows you that protective rims are not only these impregnable boundaries, they're also openings, right? They allow a mode of access to a rudimentary level of the delimitation of bodily stimuli. And in this sense, they are an important part of the work done with autistic subjects that experience these difficulties with their bodies. This goes against what Franz Tusten was saying. So Franz Tusten was speaking about the autistic object, but she was arguing that it is purely pathological. What I'm saying is that achieving a level of protection that relies on the incorporation of objects in a rim, or what autistic people call in a stim, and then the establishment of protective boundaries, regardless of the original objects, by using signs as a linguistic object in a stim, is part and parcel of the clinical work done with autistic subjects. So how we would see this work, and I'll just briefly comment, it would be therapists, psychologists, occupational therapists, all involved in assisting children to identify effective objects in their environment. So it means a clinical environment that is rich with objects of many shapes, sizes, tactile consistencies, volumes, colors, tastes. You see, there's so many avenues to work with autistic children, be it cooking, dancing, drawing, singing, going on trips in nature. All of these are potential platforms for this type of work. And what practitioners do, and here we speak about the practice among several, right? This means practitioners from a plurality of backgrounds, following children and observing when they select and insert an object, be it an actual object or linguistic object, into a repetitive ritual. And then they can assist them in expanding their ritualistic repertoire by generalizing its protective function. I'll give you an example from a colleague of mine, from the work of a colleague of mine, who worked with a girl that was constantly banging her head on the door. Now, on the one hand, this was a stimming, right? This was a repetitive ritual that enabled her to survive in the world. On the other hand, that was also quite, I don't know, not so medically fit to bang one's head on the wall. And in their work with this child, after identifying this particular, what we call protective rim, seeing that it has dynamic value for her, they didn't just prevent her from doing that. Right? They attempted to teach her the value of metonymy, the impact, the sound, the stim. They demonstrated how they can mimic it, can copy it using other musical instruments. So instead of banging the head, they finally found it. And you know, it is, I speak a lot with autistic adults, and it is, I'm sure some of you might identify with this. Sometimes you know that something is right. It feels right. Think about synesthesia. Someone would say the color, the number 5 is blue. It is not a guess. It is not approximation. This is it. Huh? So again, finding the resonance of the bang on the head, it took some time because they had to find it for this particular girl. It's not something that can just easily be replaced. But they were very adamant, and that eventually happened. The girl also formed interest in music, and that was continuing avenue for her treatment. So that's what I'll say about protective rims. I'll keep it at that today. Remind me, we said that we do an hour for talk and an hour for questions. Is that, Phoebe, is that what we agreed on?
More or less. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just making sure. We'll take another step then. We'll talk about systemizing rims. Okay. So when we think about protective rims and their dynamic function, we can see that their function can exceed its protective sensational character towards achieving something that is more on the level of satisfaction. Here it is protection. We're not yet speaking about a personal mode of satisfaction. We're speaking about mediating the drive, preventing it from brutally entering and exiting the body. But these can move to the level of satisfaction, and this is where systemizing rims come into the picture. again, we see here repetitive processes of trial and error, where autistic children mostly construct orderly systems of knowledge about the world, about their encounters with objects, that enable a satisfaction. And I've identified a satisfaction on the level of the body and the level of the intellect. So these are two types of systemizing rims. Now, systemizing is a term that I borrow from the world of psychology. It is not a psychoanalytic term. It's a term that refers to the desire to explore, analyze, and construct systems of knowledge. Now, autistic subjects that lean towards systemizing are often able to find satisfaction in, let's say, analyzing how systems work, predicting, controlling, building new systems. And systemizing entails an intricate use of language to establish an order to the world, one that makes it more predictable, but also provides the subject with an access to an intimate and idiosyncratic mode of satisfaction. Now, some studies from the field of psychology suggest that systemizing may provide a way for autistic people to find comfort and relief from stressors and a way to cope with negative emotional experience. This is already empirical research that is out of my field of study. But in psychoanalytic terms, systemizing could be described as a supplementary strategy for the organization of drive functioning. So systemizing RIM are considered to establish these restricted modes of drive fixation, right? And they create islands of drive satisfaction. So if you might think about the drive circuit being fixated at an early age, in the case of neurosis, for instance, it creates a generalized attitude towards drive satisfaction on the oral level, for instance. In autism, we won't see a generalized mode of drive satisfaction, but we'll see a building up of islands, or let's say restricted modes of drive satisfaction. Particular modes of drive satisfaction that are skillfully cultivated and are used to enrich the subject's relationship with its environment. So let's start with the level of the body. What is systemizing on the level of the body? Systemizing that creates bodily satisfaction, systemizing rims, are constructs that combine and transform localized protective functions of several autistic objects into a complex apparatus that enables the subject to use its body to achieve satisfaction and enable the subject to handle more intricate goals in more complex circumstances. Now, again, I'll make a quick distinction here between protective rims and systemizing rims on this level. Protective rims involve this passive adoption of objects, right? The child contingently encounters these objects in the surroundings. But systemizing rims involve an active investment in the election of objects. So it is a development of a taste, of a style. No? Protective rims take the form of rhythmic modes of repetition, right? The stimming. Systemizing rims are open to change. They have characteristics that develop over time, and they can adapt to different contexts and situations. They're more complex than these simple protective rims. And I'll give you a very famous example from the work of Bruno Bettelheim. It is the case of a 9-year-old autistic boy named Joey. You can read about it in a paper published by Bettelheim called Joey the Mechanical Boy. Now, Joey regains his access to his body through the construction of a system of mechanical apparatuses that is made out of autistic objects. So, for instance, in order to enter the dining room and enjoy food, Joey connects the table to an energy source and attaches it to a paper napkin. You see, it is an apparatus. He uses the machine as a systemized blueprint for his body. And through this blueprint, he is able to control it. Another example is he uses a different machine when he goes to the toilet. And if that machine operates, he is able to defecate. Slowly, he builds a bigger and bigger and more complex machine made out of actual objects. And as he progresses in the institute, he is able to take on it himself, the dynamic qualities of the objects, losing the objects themselves, but remaining with their function. By the way, it's a little spoiler, but not a big deal. He eventually becomes an electrician. He leaves the institute and becomes an electrician. So this, you see that here we see a creation of a system made of objects, be them actual or linguistic, that is implemented in a complex way in tandem to the body. So again, you imagine this as an actual rim to the body, in order to produce satisfaction, bodily satisfaction, not only to survive, but to produce bodily satisfaction, drive satisfaction in our terms. On the level of the intellect now, we speak about systemizing rims that achieve intellectual satisfaction through the orderly systemization of structures of knowledge. This means engaging with building and expanding fields of knowledge that has been shown to help autistic subjects also deal with anxiety. So I mean in this, that the anxiety that is subjective is many times the initiator of these particular interests. Now, a subjective interest in systemization can turn sometimes into what many autistic people call special interests. Again, this is a term from the world of autistic people. Now, there's a lot of studies about special interests, and studies show that the vast majority of autistic subjects, and this means between 80 and 95% of autistic subjects, have special interests in a particular area. And this can be many things. Cataloging objects, identifying linguistic patterns, gaining a proficiency, I don't know, about aircrafts or trains or transportation, creative interests like drawing, fascination with the way machine works. There are many topics, cartoon characters, fantasy world construction. I can go on and on. There are many, many forms of special interests. And studies show that autistic children have, on average, 8 special interests at a time, and that these intersect with each other many times. And again, these empirical studies show that they contribute to the development of expertise, of knowledge. They promote learning. They motivate children to collect information through books, through other sources. And they also provide opportunities for social interaction, right, with other autistic people who have similar interests. And in this sense, they generate positive emotions and coping strategies. And they also induce a sense of pride, right, and general well-being. Now, when special interests are implemented in the organization of drive functioning and give rise to an intellectual form of satisfaction, then we call them systemizing rims. How do we work with autistic subjects that construct these rims? Well, we encourage and support their construction. This entails assisting maybe in finding objects or relevant fields of knowledge from which the organization of drive satisfaction can benefit, and developing them, being very interested in them during session, attempting to generalize their use. Right? So on the level of the body, this would mean addressing other body-related issues by expanding the structure of systemization. So, for instance, deeply engaging with the dynamic quality of the object used on the body through speech, through artistic expression, leading to a point where the object can be neglected, but its dynamic function is preserved. And this is what we see in the case of Joey, basically. This is how Bettelheim worked with Joey. On the level of the intellect, this would entail engaging with others, sharing similar interests, learning about the new interests. And, well, as you will see, I'll speak about this shortly in for about 10 minutes. The use of systemizing rims can expand beyond the realm of personal satisfaction in the direction of incorporating in society. So this is a joy of being one among many. And this brings me to the last, let's say, category of rims that I call incorporating rims. Incorporating rims are homologous to systemizing rims, but they're distinct in their aim. So systemizing rims aim at a personal form of satisfaction, right? That is achieved on the level of the body or the intellect. Incorporating rims aim to include the subject as a part of a whole. It aim to produce a satisfaction from that. And this inclusion could concern the domain of intersubjective communication, social integration, as well as gender, sexuality, and sexual identity. And when the rim is constructed on this level, well, it has an effect on the drive, an effect that shifts the subject's position in relation to its environment. So when this happens, we are speaking about an incorporating rim. Let's start with the basics. Sometimes autistic people develop a special interest that has to do with, with human behavior, with psychology, with social interactions, right? And in these cases, they invest themselves in systematically learning social cues and body gestures by heart. When these skills are implemented to understand and be understood by others, they may form incorporating rims. But we have to nuance this contention, right? Because there is something that is, again, I'm giving you a lot of concepts from the world of autism today. There is a concept used by autistic people called camouflaging or masking. Camouflaging is a coping strategy to deal with social situations. It includes hiding behaviors that is associated with autism and appearing socially competent. So using nonverbal technique, body language, and hiding other difficulties in order to blend in with non-autistic people. So there's a pragmatic goal here, and it's important. You know, one wants to obtain a job, a qualification, and it's commonly less accessible when one is visibly autistic. Also graduating from school, from university, as well as establishing connections and having relationships with other people. So camouflaging is sometimes used to overcome initial obstacles and allowing for these future endeavors or relationships to develop. And in this sense, camouflaging is reported to produce a sense of satisfaction when autistic people achieve their goals. Yeah, so I've finished university. There is a satisfaction there. But there is a huge side effect to camouflaging, which is mental, physical, and emotional exhaustion, right? Because it requires constant concentration, constant monitoring, self-control. It causes great discomfort. And after that, many autistic people require a long period of recovery. And many times it causes them to slip back into solitude. Also, when one camouflages as being non-autistic, they many times don't get the adequate support that they would get in cases where their autism was visible. And then finally, camouflaging also has a negative impact on self-perception. In my work with autistic analysts, I've seen that when an interest in camouflaging provides the subject access to a knowledge that exceeds the dimension of mimicry. And these are commonly experienced as moments of personal loss, right? I would say when a psychological or behavioral model that one develops is discovered to be inherently lacking. And then it is developed from a model into a heuristic, right? So this is a moment when the orderly system of knowledge is unable to encode a recurring aspect in human relations. And then the subject is forced to abandon their belief in the completeness of their system and invent a unique way to encode this problematic into their vocabulary. Again, I'll get back to Temple Grandin, and she speaks about it in her book, Thinking in Pictures. And last time I called it what she calls it as getting a new version of software to the computer. So we speak about incorporating RIMS as having to do with moments of subjective transition and major changes in someone's life. They basically entail an effect on the level of the drive that impacts the subject's incorporation in the humanized world. I previously called it the Umwelt. Now, there are two other major types of incorporating RIMS. The other one, the second one has to do, the first one has to do with gaining a sense of understanding of the human world and being understood. So it is a sense of, let's say, self-perception. The second form has to do with actual social integration, right? With taking a place within society, achieving a substantial level of social integration that entails some type of investment of the subject's inner world in a domain that exceeds their control. There's a lot to say about this, and you can read a lot about this in, I think, in Don Williams's books in the plural. The third aspect, or the third modality of the incorporating rim has to do with gender, sexuality, and sexual identity. We see this many times among autistic patients, a certain ambivalence, struggle, uneasiness with the question of gender, sexuality, and sexual identity. And in psychoanalytic terms, we can speak about these in the distinction between the ego ideal and ideal ego. Right? The ideal ego is the ideal body image that masks the fragmented reality of the child's body. This is what Lacan associates with the mirror stage, that organizes and facilitates motor development and situates the body in the world. The identification with the ideal ego also brings into the fore the question of gender, sexuality, and sexual identity. And we see a large overlap, and I'm going back to empirical studies, between autism and trans and non-binary modalities of gender. And some studies suggest that there's a higher rate of trans and non-binary gender identity in autism, and some identify it as a symptom of autism. So these studies generally assume that autism and trans non-binary gender identity are both non-normative and inherently distorted, and therefore must stem from one from the other. Again, you see my opposition to this. Now, from a Lacanian perspective, rather than assuming an interaction between autism and trans non-binary gender identities, and assuming that they originate in a shared deficit, autistic sexuality and gender identity are both described in terms of the subject's relationship with language. Now, for Lacan, unlike animals, other animals, non-human animals at least, that commonly engage in sexual behavior in accordance to a predetermined species-specific instinctual cue, humans have to rely on the signifier to engage in sex. And in this sense, an animal will have only a limited number of performed sexual bearings, right? Whereas for humans, the signifier opens up a possibility to know something, to say something about one's gender, sexuality, sexual identity, regardless of the organismic instinct. Now, autistic, we said, rely on signs. And in this sense, they are also able to construct systemized fields of knowledge about gender, sexuality, and sexual identity. And these are usually consistent, rule-bound relationships between concepts and objects. So in this sense, you would many times, or at least in my experience, I've heard several autistic analysants who chose their sexual orientation consciously, as a choice, as in adult life, as a pragmatic choice, even, I would say. Not, I mean, complying with some predetermined bodily orientation, but just at some point decided, yes, I am this or I am that. That's what I have decided. Now, what I wanted to say, and I see I'm a bit over time, so I'll patch up. I'll patch up now. Because autistic people develop these systems of knowledge on sexuality and gender, they also very easily perceive their imperfections. They can easily identify contradictions in the societal discourse on sex. In a way, something about the sexual non-rapport is quite evident when sexuality is divided into a matrix of signs. And this is why autistic gender identification is more open to fluid avenues of gender identity and sexual identity. And when I speak about incorporating RIMS on this level, I speak about these systemized fields of knowledge that demarcate a position from where the subject is able to identify and formulate a unique outlook on sexual relationships and pleasure. They enable an identification, we might say, with a supplementary ideal ego. And this identification has a deep subjective effects, and it leads from what is called gender dysphoria, state of anxiety, depression, dissociation, to what some call gender euphoria. It's a distinct enjoyment or satisfaction that is caused by correspondence between gender identity and gender features. Incorporating RIMS that function on this level it can achieve that also in the course of the work with autistic people. So I'll just summarize and say a final note. We've spoken about a differential clinic of the RIM and the way that objects, be it actual objects or linguistic objects, are used to construct RIMs with different dynamic functions. I've divided these into three large groups: protective RIMs, systemizing RIMs, and incorporating RIMs. And I've argued that in the work with autistic people in the clinic, we must identify the direction of the treatment, let's say, is identified with constructing one of these modalities, if not two or three. My final note is that I've given you a list of three general types. I've collected these from autistic people. I haven't invented it myself. I have just watched, observed, talked with autistic people, tried to deduce the structural features of their own solutions, of their own cure of themselves, and try to think how this can be implemented in the analytic relationship. This does not mean that there are not more types of RIMs. I'm sure there are, and it is just a question of more practitioners developing the theory, developing the work, and then providing us with insight to a new technique. So what I want to end with is to say that in no way do I say that that is it. We're done. We found all the RIMs. No, there are many more RIMs to be found. And yeah, I would suggest to those of you that do work with autistic people to search for them exactly in their own spontaneous solutions. This is the best place to find them. And I'll end here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leon. That was so informative and very interesting approach.
Thank you.
I'm sure that many of us have lots of ideas, and I know that we have been discussing this among our own workshops lately sometimes. So we will give time for the questions now. So if there are any questions, just raise your hand or write them in the chat. We just need to remind you that to keep the questions concise and as short as possible, so we can have time to, so we can have enough time for everyone. Okay. Is there any questions, any thoughts, any comments, or anything you want to share?
اوكي دكتورة فيبي، ممكن سؤال؟
هتسألوا بالإنجلش ولا بالعربي؟
اوكي بالعربي بس. يعني الليبيدو، يعني كيف يعمل الليبيدو في هي حسب لاكان، يعني لأنه فرويد عنده نظرية الأوتو إيغوتيزم، وكانت يعني غير مفهومة في عصره. يعني فالسؤال هو كيف يعمل الليبيدو يعني في هي الريم اللي ذكرها، يعني الليبيدو كيف بيشتغل في الذات اوكي.
Okay, so
هذا كان سؤال.
Mr. Muhammad Amin's question is about the libido's role in this approach. How does it work, or where we can find it here?
Yes, this was the subjects of today's talk, and I called it drive satisfaction today. But think about this in this way: what is the humanized world? What is the human world? What exists in the human world? What exists are only objects that are invested with libido. This is what exists, and what can exist. This is how Freud, I think, saw it. It is somewhat, I think, of a Kantian twist. I'm speaking of Immanuel Kant here. The world of objects is a world of objects invested with libido. And this is why Lacan says man thinks with his objects. Because libido, as we know, is something of the psyche. The idea is that in autism, we see a shift in drive functioning that is so dramatic. And if we speak about libido, and I'll keep it in Freudian terms here, we see a regression then not only from the state of object love to narcissism. Yeah, and this is what Freud used to describe psychotic regression. We see a decline from narcissism into a state of, we might say, and I think I heard you say it, autoerotism. I do not equate autoerotism with autism in any way. But I'm saying that something about Freud's intuition about autoerotism as a universe that lacks distinction, lacks separation. It is a world without a subject, a world without an ego. This is more akin to the autistic solitude that we see in very early stages of the development of let's say, of autism in an early age. These are children that live in an impoverished world. It is a world that has very few objects within it. And this is exactly because there are very few mediated islands of libidinal investment. Libido, the drive circuit, is altered in such a dramatic way that there are barely, I can just be figurative here, but tiny openings of libidinal investment in the world. Tiny places. And here I speak about a touch, a particular sensation of a sweater. This is the world of the autistic child on this level. And this has everything to do with libido. The question is, in autism, how do we rely on signs in creating a world? Yes. And this means, how do we invest libido? How do we find intersections where libido can be invested? And first, libido is invested for the sake of protection. These are creation of libidinal barriers to the body. Lately, in the last 2 years, I've been thinking about this in terms of the skin. Thinking about the skin as an erogenous organ. So, and I'm thinking about skin phenomena in autism. One has to construct the skin first. Then libido can be invested in a way that produces satisfaction, as I was saying. Be it bodily satisfaction or intellectual satisfaction. This is libido. And then finally, libido is invested in a shared domain, a shared libidinal domain, what many scholars call today a libidinal economy. One exchanges objects invested with libido. These are the incorporating rims. So I think that your question was very exact because it had exactly to do with what we were speaking about today. A differential clinic that puts an emphasis on a supplementary form of libidinal investment in the world. Maybe there's a follow-up, Phoebe, I'm not sure. But I see Mahmoud also has a question. But yeah, I'm happy to answer everyone today.
Okay, so thank you. We have first a question in the chat, and then we will take Dr. Mahmoud's question. So the question is from Jumana. Can you explain why the autistic children have a specific nutritional pattern? Mostly they eat solid food, and some remain on drinking milk only for several years. That's the question. She adds, she noticed that during dealing with Asperger teenagers, lots of non-sexual, lots of them are non-sexual. Are they really non-sexual, or is it a problem dealing with the body?
Yes, two very good questions. The first having to do with digestion, with food intake. I know today there are a lot of theories that have nothing to do with psychoanalysis, that argue that autism has to do with some type of gut bacterium disorder. And there are some diets, and some studies show results, don't show results, etc. But the question here, when we think about the intake of food, I view it, and I haven't developed this idea, so I'm thinking with you today. I view it as having to do with orality, with the oral drive. And particularly with its sensorial dimension, right? The consistency of a food. It's not even the taste. It is the consistency of the food, the way the food would touch the tongue, the mouth, the throat. This I can say two things. First, we know that the struggle with excitation, with libido in autism happens on the rim of the body. This is the drama of autism. We say in Lacanese, jouissance returns on the rim in autism. In psychosis, in paranoid psychosis, jouissance returns in the big other. schizophrenic psychosis, jouissance returns in the body. And in autism, jouissance returns on the rim. And the question of consistency of food has to do with this sensorial character of the rim. So I think that we have to understand that one has to create a rim even to the mouth in order to eat. And let's say milk or liquid is the closest one can get to a non-texture. Something that came to my mind, my second answer here, is something that came to my mind because I'm returning to Lacan's family complex paper. And he speaks there of the weaning complex, the point where the baby gives up on the milk of the mother as the actual trauma of birth. This is how Lacan engages with it. It's a very interesting text because later in 48 in the mirror stage, he will disagree with that. But he says that birth itself, we conceive of it as a traumatic separation from the mother, whereas at that point, what is experienced on this level is not registered in a way that is impactful, according to Lacan. And it is actually the weaning from the mother's milk that is the trauma of separation. It is there that there exists then an other and a subject, and that's at that point. And we do say that, well, autism originates in let's say a refusal of separation, a trauma of separation. And then if we want to think about it psychoanalytically, we associate that with a refusal of weaning. So I would say this is another way to engage with this question psychoanalytically. The suggestion more than an answer. About being asexual, that's true. And as I said, it is an ambivalence that one feels, very different than what we see, let's say, in the case of Schreber. Right? Schreber had to become the wife of God. It was imperative, not only for him, but for humanity. It was at the center of his project, of the process of his psychosis. So you see that the question, this question of sexuality and the relationship, the sexual relationship is central. It is not, the psychotic subject is not nonchalant about it. It becomes a project. Whereas in autism, we see an ambivalence. We see a detachment. It is not pressing. Even an autistic subject will say that they are non-sexual. One must investigate, at least from my experience. It seems that one does masturbate. One does gain sexual satisfaction from, let's say, by watching pornography, etc. But one does not seek to situate themselves in a community of sexual subjects. And the thing is that one can remain in that position quite comfortably. And we also see couples of autistic people that don't have sex, that are both asexual. It is not a pressing issue. What I have to say about this is more on an ethical comment. And I'll remind you of a television show that exists on Netflix that's called Dating on the Spectrum. And this is a television show where mostly autistic participants are sent on dates with mostly autistic people. And what I find so funny or troubling about this show is that they receive coaching prior to these dates, and they are basically taught how to date neurotic people. So they say, oh, you have to ask them about that. But if they say this, you have to tell them that. And you have to hold their chair, and you have to present yourself in this way. A great advice if you have a date with an erotic subject. But they are dating autistic subjects. So it is very, very funny. It is two autistic subjects dating each other, behaving as though they're dating neurotic subjects. I find that an
Ah oui.
interesting lesson for
Ah
us
oui.
practitioners.
Ah oui.
Yeah.
Ah oui.
And this is also
Mm.
important for the question of asexuality. The question of sexual identity and gender, especially in the liberal West, is extremely pertinent. It is on the minds of the youth, of everyone. It is a political question at this point. And in this sense, we as therapists might be alarmed when an autistic subject tells us, I don't want to have sex. But what I'm saying is that we shouldn't think about that from our neurotic perspective. It is not that we should teach them about sexuality as it is played out for neurotic subjects. Being non-sexual for many autistic people is completely fine. It is not part of their struggle or their wish. Their struggle exists elsewhere. So my sort of ethical advice is, well, first my clinical observations agrees with you. This is the case, and I think that there is a unique type of ambivalence that we see in the relationship between autistic subjects and their sexual identity. But I think that it is the question of the subject's choice if they want to engage with that question and maybe struggle with it to some extent at therapy or not. If they do, then what we've spoken about today, the incorporating rim, question of the ideal ego comes to the fore, and one can make a choice. And I've seen these choices happen in front of my eyes many times for completely personal reasons. Reasons that could be completely pragmatic, that will surprise you. That at some point one decides that they are a man and they will be attracted to women. And this is how it goes. So as I said, many aspects of the work that we do with patients that is implicit, it is in negotiation with the unconscious. It is not about intellectualization and understanding and asking oneself what is better, A or B. In the work with autistic people, it would be that way. This is how I see it. Lacan says the unconscious is à ciel ouvert, out in the open. He speaks about psychosis here, but I think that in autism, it is really out there. The unconscious it exists, yes, but it is out there, and one can work with it, systemize it, configure it, and that is also done on the level of sexual identity and gender. That's it. We lost Mahmoud, I think.
I'm still there.
Oh,
I'm still there.
okay.
Okay, so you can ask your question.
اوكي انا حسبت ان احنا بنعمل ترجمة بعد
محمود.
دكتور عمرو يعني سايبين القنوات زي ما هي هتسأل بالإنجلش صح؟
اوكي
ويلي محمود.
يس
ويلي محمود. زيد.
because the
white
focus,
t-shirt, the white
the focus
t-shirt.
is on the speakers, so you can't see the whole gallery. So you can change this from the view, and you can see the whole people.
So I have two questions, Dr. Brenner. Thank you for your lecture. The first one, I read the book till the autistic part. I read before the autistic part, where you talk about exclusion as a constitutive mechanism of the subject, the structuration of the subject.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah.
um, I expect to find my answer when I continue to read the book, but I also want to hear from you what gets excluded or affirmed, or is there also a failure of primal repression in the autistic subject as well? I think in one of your lectures, there was a question about the unconscious in autism. You said there was maybe there is no unconscious in autism. I think something like that. So what gets excluded, what gets affirmed, what is I or what is not I in autism, or what gets foreclosed. Second question is um, while listening to your lecture, I feel like we have a lot to learn from autistic people about the human condition in general. Like in the first lecture, you said that no one exists in the cosmos. Every animal exists in an environment. But I feel like philosophers do exist in the cosmos in a way, scientists and also arts and many great people who advance our knowledge as a human species in general. They are, I feel, they are in a quite similar position to that, the relationship to truth or lying, to sexuality, to many great things, to many features of autism. I feel like they are connected to the human condition in general. I want to hear your opinion about that. Thank you.
Can you rephrase the last question? And I love
okay.
Just the question. I've got the beginning of it, and I have something to say about it. But the last question, if you could repeat it.
The last question. I feel there are similarities between because we don't talk about autism as one thing. We talk about it as a spectrum, and there are autistic people who achieve great many things. So when you say that no one exists in the cosmos in general, and that the fragmentation in the autistic subject in the beginning, how his trauma to interlanguage, his hardship of entering interlanguage, and so on. Doesn't this in a way mimic our position as a species in general, when we think ourselves not only as individuals, but as part of the humankind, as a species occupying this planet, in this, etc., etc. So, in a way, we exist in the cosmos, you know. I don't know if you
Okay.
When a philosopher comes and produces a new system of knowledge, isn't this similar to what the autistic subject is doing? The systemizing, like you know.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Very deep, interesting philosophical question.
I'm sorry for not being as concise and lucid or clear as.
It's great, and I'm thinking about it, and I'll just pull up one of my notes, and I'll answer you in a second. Okay. So, about your first question, which is the easier one. Yes, this is what I do in this book. It's a very serious attempt to use all of the conceptual tools that psychoanalysis provides in order to demonstrate a different type of, as you called it very correctly, constitutive exclusion at the core of autism. This is speaking about repression, for instance, as the cause of neurosis, right? Freud says that. And Lacan speaks of foreclosure as the cause of psychosis. And that doesn't even change later in his teaching on psychosis, you know, because the fact that the name of the father is foreclosed in the beginning, it is something that is more general, and later there are other solutions that can be found to it. So we're still staying with the foreclosure. So Lacan remains Freudian. And what I do in the book is I try to demonstrate a different type of exclusive mechanism at the core of autism. This is the whole book. I hope, Mahmoud, you won't have too much of a headache. Take it piece by piece. But this is what I do up in the book from chapter 1 till chapter 5. Yeah, so chapter 6 is the only one that doesn't engage with this question. I'll quickly say just keywords here because we cannot get to explaining it. But I distinguish it as whereas Lacan sees psychotic foreclosure going against the operation of Bejahung in primary repression, I describe autistic foreclosure as operating on the level of Ausstoßung in primary repression. These are terms that Freud uses in his paper Negation, 1925, to describe primary repression. And then I also demonstrate or suggest 3 different objects that might be foreclosed in autism. The first is the unary trait. And there's a lot of interesting work on that, the trait unaire. How does Freud call it? Einziger Zug, the unary trait as the object of autistic foreclosure. And there's a lot of work written about that and also how we see it in the clinic. Then I speak about the rim as a possible object. And this is what we spoke about today, the rim of the drive. And then in the last part of chapter 5, I suggest that it is actually the particular rim of the invocatory drive. So it might only be the question of the voice in autism. This is what I suggest in the third part as an option. By distinguishing the work of this constitutive mechanism on these levels, I argue that autism cannot be psychosis. There's no way to reduce one to the other. This is the general argument in the book. But read on. I encourage you. And if you have any questions, as you do, Mahmoud, please write to me gladly. About your second question, which is such a profound philosophical question, do we exist in the cosmos? Does someone exist in the cosmos? I think this is what I got from it. You are
Maybe briefly, like, you know.
Come again?
Maybe briefly.
Yes. Let's
where does Einstein lives when he invents general relativity, or Hegel when he writes about whatever, like Kant, or where do they live? They don't live like an animal in his environment with his instincts, or is that like, you know, something like that?
So my answer is going to be built like this. We'll start with Kant. We'll go to contemporary interface theory of perception, and we'll finish with Lalande. Yeah, this is how we'll engage with this. So, you know, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, made this Copernican revolution in philosophy. He was influenced by David Hume, who was an empiricist. And David Hume got to a conclusion, and you can read his book, Treatise on Human Nature. He got to the conclusion that causality, which is basically the most elementary aspect of nature and science, is a human fabrication. It doesn't exist in the objects of the
It's
world.
arbitrary.
Yeah, it is out of fancy, he says. He uses the
Yeah.
word fancy. It's a very Scottish kind of word to use here. And Kant's mind was blown. It's like, wow, how can I engage with that? And the change that Kant brought into the world of philosophy and epistemology was arguing that, yes, causation does exist in the mind. We might say, I'm a bit generalizing here, but in the structure of our perception, of our consciousness, but that the world itself is composed of this structure as well. So the structures of the mind are the structures of the world. This is what he called the phenomena. Phenomena is the experiential world, the world of objects. The world of objects abides by these concepts that come from the structure of consciousness, the structure of the subject. Lacan is quite Kantian in many aspects. But for Kant, there was also the noumena. The noumena is that thing that is not captured by the structure of consciousness, by the structure of the subject. It is, as later we call it, the thing as itself. Right? It is the thing without whatever the subject imposes on the universe to create it as a phenomenon. A huge discussion among post-Kantians is, does the noumena exist regardless and completely separate of the phenomena, as that thing that has nothing to do with the structures of our consciousness? It is there and we have no access to it. Or is the phenomena a creation that is based on the noumena? Now we'll speak in the terms that we spoke so far. Is the universe part of the humanized Umwelt, of the humanized world? Yeah. The humanized world is, of course, a reduction of it, but it is something that has to do with the actual universe. Or are we idealists like Berkeley saying there is no universe, there is no cosmos, there is only what is humanized, what we think, what is endowed with libido? I'll say agnostic with this discussion, but I'll give you an example for a theory that argues otherwise. It's called interface theory of perception. It's a very modern theory about your question. It engages with your question practically. You can download the paper, Interface Theory of Perception. It's a very famous theory because it's based on computer learning models that they taught to behave in specific ways. And I'll spare you, I'll get to the conclusions. They concluded that evolutionary development rewards organisms that have no relationship, that know nothing of the cosmos. This is what they got to the conclusion, that evolution rewards organisms that work only according to whatever works for them. And that thing has nothing to do with the actual state of the universe. This is their conclusion. So basically they are saying there is no cosmos. They're saying there might be, but it has nothing to do with what Einstein was inventing. Einstein is working on an interface.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is similar to you play the game, you don't think about the game.
Exactly. And look, it's easy to understand this maybe figuratively. I'm speaking to a computer. Yeah. In order to meet you today, I pressed on an icon. I think it's blue. Yeah. And the icon sort of opened this thing, and here you are. What I'm doing is interacting with an interface. What happened in my computer is like many different electronic devices shot electricity, stopped shooting electricity, started. If this is the cosmos, when I was contacting you today, I knew nothing of the cosmos. I have nothing to do with the cosmos. And the blue icon on my computer is not a description of the cosmos. It does not communicate anything as to the nature of the actual cosmos. It only enables me to see you and meet you today in a quick and easy way. And this is what these evolutionary psychologists think today, that they think that human reality is an interface. Yeah. And the cosmos has nothing to do with it. This is what they think. But let me get to a psychoanalytic answer to your very interesting philosophical question, right? Lacan at a certain point coins the term la langue, right? So the term la langue is opposed to language, to langue. La langue is the primary chaotic substrate out of which language is constructed. So it is that Lacan is saying that language, the one that we speak right now, the one that Einstein uses to describe the world, is ordered in some, it's some type of superstructure that is sitting on top of this substrate, right? La langue is the material that enables us to intellectualize. And la langue, well, la langue is the non-communicative aspect of language, the one that plays on ambiguity, on homophony, that gives rise to jouissance. La langue is language as jouissance. And in this sense, Einstein is speaking about the universe, but whatever enables him to speak is jouissance. So Einstein is only superimposing systems on jouissance. And in this sense, we might oppose the universe here. The universe, the cosmos, is jouissance. And on top of that, we can build our theories and our languages. Huh? So that's an answer, a sort of a roundabout answer for you about this. But this entails a further discussion, Mahmoud, and we'll do it at a future time. Thanks for this question. It's an opportunity for me to philosophize a little bit.
Okay, thank you. So we have two more questions. We'll take the first from Dr. Sarah Boufakhreddin.
Hello.
Hi.
سامعني
You'll
يا
ask your
فيبي?
yes.
Okay.
You'll
Do you
ask
hear
in
me well?
English,
Okay.
right? Yes.
In English. I will try. I will try in English.
Yeah. Okay.
Good evening, Mr. Dr. Brenner. I'll try to surface up because I just went through the deep question with Mahmoud, so I lost my flow of thoughts. So first, I'll thank you a lot. I'm really delighted to have you with us in person. I've previously seen your videos, so I was really surprised by Phoebe when you were personally with us. So I hope I'm not really naive in these two questions. The first is, I think in the second video, in the second series, you spoke about the positioning of the analyst. Positioning of the analyst for each structure inside the session. So, and I suppose that you said that autism is a fourth structure, if I understood well.
Yes.
So, so the positioning here with today's lecture, it was really a bit complex for me, this fourth lecture, so I have to go back. But if I have to guess, the analyst would be on the intermediary between on the rim, like the intermediary between the analysand and the outer world. This is my guess. So where is, this is like, if I put it simply, where is the positioning in this case for the analyst? And by the way, I think I understood, I worked for the design of the association, and I now understood why you asked to change the design and put shapes, colors, and when we saw your book, and I saw that there is shapes, colors, and sizes, and we changed like something similar now. Today I understood why. This is the first question. Okay. So shall I go for the second, or I wait for the answer?
Go for the second. I'll do them both.
Okay. Second is also clinical. What do you think about the late diagnosis of autism? Like I've heard many autistic, like 3 years of analysis, and after like they go to a different clinic or different practitioner, not specifically psychoanalyst, and they're diagnosed as autistic. Is it really realistic? Is it good to diagnose? Is it like, what's the role of the psychoanalyst in the diagnosis? What to do here? What's your experience on this? Maybe it's not really the time. Maybe we will meet later to answer this question, but I'm really interested in this type of clinical experiences.
Okay. So thank you, Sarah. So the first question is very pertinent because I told you, I think, at some point that when I say that autism is a distinct structure, the only thing that I mean is that we have to think of a different clinic for it. And in psychoanalytic terms, this means a particular positioning within the transference. So this is all it means for psychoanalysts. The clinical diagnostic criteria means one thing. How will one position themselves in the transference in order to achieve a psychoanalytic effect? You have, I think, very maybe intuitively and acutely situated or called the position on the rim. I completely agree. This is the general term for it. If I have to gather all of the different modes of operation that an analyst would take in the work with autistic subjects, and as we said, it's a spectrum, it's a huge spectrum of work. It will always be on the rim. This is how we would define it. But within this this particular mode of positioning, and there's so many works written about transference in the work with neurotic subjects, and basically most of Lacan's teaching, when he speaks about transference, he speaks about neurosis. He doesn't speak about psychosis. He does give us some pointers about psychosis at some point, also in the early seminar, later seminars as well, but just bits. There's nothing comprehensive about it, whereas I'm speaking really fast. I'm just I'll speak slow. But on neurosis, we get so much. For psychosis, Lacan says in seminar 3, at some point, the analyst is a secretary. He says it, right? You need to take a position of a secretary. The secretary doesn't change or interpret the boss's unconscious or remain obscure or mystical. No, the secretary asks, "What did you say?" "Oh, that's very good. Can you repeat that? Can you clarify? Oh, you talked about that, but you said that you'll get back to it. Can you say that? Can you get back to that again?" It is more of taking a position of a witness than what we classically see as an analyst. So Lacan spoke about that. He also talked about it in negative terms as avoiding the erotomania that we see in the case of Schreber, for instance, to not to step into that place of the subject supposed to know. So the analyst is not a subject supposed to know about the analysis's unconscious, and not to trigger a psychosis, not to trigger a paranoia. So we have these little bits. On autism, we have nothing. Yes, we have nothing. In Lacan, he speaks a little bit about Melanie Klein in her work with Little Dick, but nothing really, really to bite into. But there are other scholars that have developed these notions briefly, I might say, and it's a current project of mine, basically, Sarah. At this point, it's a project of mine to elucidate these different modes of transference. More than saying, yes, it is on the rim. Yes, the analyst is an instrument to construct a rim. Today, we spoke about these different rims, and the analyst is there as a mediator to these constructions.
So he's the one who's supposed to know in this case. As you said, and I think you said it before, like you played for some autistic client analysant, like you're supposed to know about unconscious.
No, I said that I was a pure logician. Yeah.
Okay.
The only thing I knew is about logic. The only thing I knew is about the logic of language, and to think about an argument or a concept, and to see if it is bulletproof, if there is no way out of it, if there is no ambiguity with it, and constantly pointing to the ambiguity of a conceptual system. So it was more like some type of expert on philosophical logic or something like that. It is not knowing about the unconscious at all.
Okay.
In this sense. And again, clinically speaking, many autistic people that will come to you will assume that you know and will ask you to tell them. What am I really? What does this mean for me? What should I do in my life? And I do think that it is important to preserve the analytic, how do you call it, abstinence in this sense. We do not work with our counter-transference here. And let's say my training in logic, let's say, is somewhat of a training analysis in terms of counter-transference. So one has to rid themselves of their ideas, of their personal opinions, but still remain attentive to the structure of a sentence, of an argument. This is what I talked about a particular patient. I'll just give you the names of the different modes of transference, just to convince you to read about it, and maybe we can work on it at a certain point. I don't know if you're a practitioner, but we can try and develop it. The first mode of transference that I've sort of collected in my work with the literature is transference to a mastered object. This is where the analyst becomes a harmless object, but an object that exists in the autistic child's world. Because autistic children will run into your clinic and start playing with the toys if they wish, or walk around, but they will completely ignore you. And when one approaches them, when one speaks to them, it will be either ignored or reacted to with extreme violence or extreme self-inflicted violence. So this first mode of transference is positioning yourself in the place of an object in this clinic that is harmless, that will not harm. Basically, it's an object that does not desire. It is an object and not a subject. Rosine Lefort speaks about this in her work with a child. She speaks about in The Birth of the Other. It's a book translated to English as well. And she speaks about a moment where the little girl slaps her in the face, but she remains there. She doesn't react. She remains there, and the girl smiles and slaps her again on the other side of the face, really hard. But Rosine remained there. And this continues up to a point where the girl is sure that this object is an object that she can safely manipulate. It will not react in a way that scares her. And in this is when Rosine is entered into the field, into some type of diminished relationship. She is a harmless object. This is the first modality. Then we speak about fusional transference, which has to do a lot with theory of the double. This is what people also speak about as facilitative communication outside of psychoanalytic circles. It's when one holds the hand of the child for the child to print what it wants to say. Or the child has to see the therapist in their own eyes in order to go to the toilet. So this is where one identifies, but even stronger, I call it equates with aspects of this object, of this harmless object, of the analyst as a harmless object, and gains their dynamic in the therapeutic relationship and the work done with that. So there's work done with this type of equation. And then we have the final one that's called facilitative transference. I call it this way, but I'm very bad with names. And this is more of what we talked about today in terms of incorporating rims and systemating rims as a facilitator of the construction of knowledge that has a libidinal value in the aim of first gaining these dynamic qualities, yeah, but then the final gain, and this is the most psychoanalytic effect that I was speaking about, engendering a place for lack in one's dynamic structure. And this brings us to your later question, and I think we'll end here because we're out of time, about late diagnosis. First, I'll say there is a thing that we call the invisible pole of autism. It's autistic people that have developed a proficiency in neurosis, let's say, becoming subjects that are invisible in terms of their peculiarities. They might seem a little strange, yeah, but they have a job, they are married, they have kids, and we don't think that they're too strange. And they sometimes get a late diagnosis, yeah, sometimes. But from my experience, and because of my work on autism, many people that are self-diagnosed come and see me. And it always begins with, I am autistic. I know you work on autism. Please tell me that I'm autistic, and then all my problems will go away. Which clearly is a neurotic demand. Huh? And from my experience, I would say about 90% of people that come and see me, and I mean these late diagnosis people, 90% of them, roughly 90%, forget about this question after a few weeks. It has nothing to do with their problem. They go on. And this is the fact that autism is a signifier. And we can dialectize it. So in the beginning, very carefully, very gently, one tries and see if the problem is the problem of a signifier. And for all of you, this must raise red flags. Signifiers have nothing to do with autism, right? So if it's a problem of a signifier, we can then safely assume that our working hypothesis is the diagnosis of not autism. But if the problem shows itself to be, well, not a problem of the signifier, but a problem of the sign, then indeed I would work with one in this particular trajectory of work. Autism today is overly diagnosed criteria, conflated with everything you might want, you know, ADHD, psychosis. Everyone is practically autistic. I told you every husband has autistic traits. So for me,
I thought that I'm autistic now also, like at the end of this.
Exactly, because we have a tendency to identify, right? To take part in something. So
Yeah.
let's see. Let's see about you.
Thank you very
about
much.
everyone else.
I will see. Let's see. Hope not.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Brenner.
Phoebe, shall we end here?
Yes, basically, Ms. Reem's question was somewhat related to the same question that Dr. Sarah just asked. So they were basically the same. So I just have to say thank you so much for this really interesting time with you and your valuable insight on this topic. As for myself, I've gained lots of insights, and I've been looking looking into the subject of autism through many different aspects than the ones I have been taught through the years in college and masters and everything, and it's really really valuable, and it relates a lot with lots of things. I hope this is not the last lecture or the last meeting with you. I hope we get to meet you again. And I think Dr. Darwish wants to say something now.
I really thank you a lot for I find this series of lectures very interesting. I hope it's just the beginning of our cooperation with you, and we will be looking forward to listen to you during our group and to develop also this kind of work we've just started. Thank
Gladly.
you, Leon.
Gladly, and hopefully also in person in Paris very soon.
Yeah, you're welcome. Just let me know.
As I said earlier, be careful what you wish for, but it might happen. I'll let you know, of course.
Of course. But not during the Olympic Games.
Okay. Deal. Good. Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed my time with you, and we will see each other very soon.
Sure. I will contact you, and you let me know when you'll be available, and we should talk really this month, before the end of this month, I hope. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Shukran. And
Danke schön.
yes, of course.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Shukran likum,
Bonne
Jamian.
soirée
Thank you,
à vous.
everyone, for this.
Au revoir,
Thank
monsieur.
you. Thank you.
Ah.
Au revoir,
And have a
monsieur.
great night.
Au revoir à tous. Au revoir, bonne soirée. Et merci pour ces conférences très intéressantes. Merci.
شكرا لكم. Merci. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
شكرا إلى اللقاء. تصبحون على خير.
Au revoir. Au revoir, Iman. Au revoir. J'ai réussi à trouver comment. J'étais pas douée, mais j'ai trouvé. Au revoir, Iman. Bonne soirée, toi aussi.